For centuries, Jerusalem has been remembered as a sacred city, fortified and surrounded by tension. But what was it really like to live inside these walls around 700 years before Christ?
Make way, coming through.
Here, the city does not appear as some distant legend, but as a crowded, watched, noisy place, completely dependent on the routines of ordinary people.
Today, you're about to see real life inside the walls of ancient Jerusalem.
The day begins at the gate, because that is where the city measures its own rhythm. Even before the heat starts pressing down, workers, porters, and animals are already fighting for space at the entrance. The walls are not there for defense alone. They organize movement, trade, and surveillance. Whoever comes in brings food, tools, news, and uncertainty too. You can feel that pressure from the very first light of morning. In Jerusalem, around 700 years before Christ, dawn was not quiet, and it was not contemplative. It was control, movement, and attention from the very first steps inside the city.
As dawn breaks over the ancient city, the sentry's patrol is a daily ritual of vigilance.
Seen from within, these walls reveal far more than stacked stone. They work as lookout lines, military corridors, and the physical boundary of the city itself. Guards patrol, command posts regulate access, and workers watch the structure closely because any weakness could come at a high price. What lies outside matters, of course, but what happens inside matters too. This is where defense and routine meet every single day. In a city like this, security is not just part of the landscape. It is part of daily life itself. And that changes the way every person moves, watches, and reacts.
Life in the crowded residential quarters meant constant navigation. For the street corner, every delivery was a test of endurance. For the water carrier,
Inside, Jerusalem tightens around you. The passageways are narrow, detours are constant, and almost no one moves alone for long. People, animals, cargo, water, and labor all share the same space, almost always at the same time. Have you ever stepped into a place where every move forces your body to adjust? That is the logic here. The city was not built for comfort. It was built to function within the limits of its walls. Every corner demands adaptation, and every path reveals how urban life depended on forced closeness, constant attention, and a very particular kind of collective discipline.
if concern is evident, the recent harvest of poor.
A house is not just shelter. It is a kitchen, a storage area, a workshop, a place of learning, and the center of family decision-making. Small courtyards help organize light, fire, water, and movement inside. Jars hold what keeps the day going, and every corner of the home serves a practical purpose. Nothing is extra. Nothing exists only for decoration. In Jerusalem, life at home also meant working all the time. The domestic space had to answer every need. Food preparation, resource preservation, rest, repair, and the daily coexistence of several people within the same place. Yes, it is a home, but it is also part of a working machine. The domestic routine starts early, and it starts heavy. The fire has to be lit again. Grain has to be ground, water has to be returned to its proper place, and bread is already part of the day's sequence. There is no clear line between life and labor. Everything happens together, in the same space, and almost in the same rhythm. While the city wakes outside, the family's survival is already underway in here.
Heavy tools under the relentless Jerusalem sun as they headed to the repair site and flowed through these narrow streets. The driver's task, though humble, was essential to the commerce near the gate quarter.
And every gesture, no matter how simple it looks, has to work. When one of these steps fails, the impact falls straight onto the rest of the day. It is the kind of routine that seems ordinary, but holds the whole city together. Some of the men leave the domestic space early and spread out into different roles. Some head to the fields, others to transport, urban repair, trade, or work involving stone and heavy loads. Jerusalem depends on that movement to stay supplied and functioning. A tool over the shoulder, an empty basket, a pack animal, an uphill street. That is how the city connects to what exists beyond the houses.
Wool fibers are expertly twisted into durable thread.
Labor begins before any speech does. First comes the body, then the structure that effort supports within the walls. The city only looks stable because many people have already gone out to keep it standing.
Ensure these bowls are smooth before you set them out to dry. We must finish before the heat of the day.
Inside the homes, much of life keeps turning under the direction of those managing food, water, fire, fiber, and storage. Preparing, measuring, separating, preserving, and distributing are the tasks that keep the household alive. This is not background scenery. This is real resource management. And in a compact city like this, controlling what goes in and out of every jar truly matters. Without that labor, Jerusalem locks up from the inside. The family's balance depends on rhythm, memory, experience, and constant attention to available materials. It is a quiet form of management, but a decisive one, sustaining the city without ever standing at the center of the image.
Water was life in ancient Judah. Every drop had to be hauled from deep within the earth. A daily
Children grow up seeing everything up close and joining the work early, always on a smaller scale. They observe, imitate, make mistakes, repeat, and little by little become part of the family's working logic. There is no hard boundary between learning and doing. Skill is born through contact with everyday gestures. Carrying a small container, sorting grain, following an older sibling, watching the craftsperson in the street. It may seem like very little, but that is how a city passes survival from one generation to the next. Learning here is practical, quiet, and fully woven into routine. No one announces it. It simply happens, day after day.
pockets of ancient Jerusalem. Daily life revolved around staples like grain.
Water here is not some detail in the background. It is weight, time, discipline, and real survival. Every full jar demands movement, physical effort, and control inside the home. Do you see how even a small amount of waste changes everything? In Jerusalem, the household water supply sets the rhythm of both body and routine. And the tighter the city becomes, the more valuable every container stored in the shade becomes too. Water has to be brought in, protected, measured, and used with care. Once it enters the home, it becomes something close to a strategic reserve, not just an ordinary resource for the day. In a walled city, every drop arrives already carrying responsibility.
Raising the walls of the vessel and centuries of tradition dictate this precise movement. The potter relies on instinct to judge the heat before committing the vessel to the fire.
With practice,
The market concentrates food, labor, and information all at once. Grain, oil, textiles, and pottery move through it, but so do warnings, rumors, and signs of what is changing beyond the walls. No one passes through this space only to buy. They come to listen, to observe, and to understand the mood of the city. And if this kind of historical reconstruction pulls you in, make sure to like the video and follow the channel, because it is exactly in these details of everyday life that ancient Jerusalem feels most alive. In the end, the market is where the city's daily routine meets, almost without noticing, the tension of the world outside. The workshops reveal a city that does not depend on faith or defense alone. It depends on skill. Shaped clay, woven fabric, cut stone, repaired tools. All of it keeps urban life moving. There is no glamour in it, but there is precision, repetition, and accumulated experience. And truth be told, this is where the city takes shape with its own hands.
This bearer carries us. Before approaching the sacred complex, residents underwent a meticulous cleansing ritual, ensuring both physical and spiritual purity.
Craft labor provides utensils, repairs, storage, construction, and material continuity. Each workshop reveals practical knowledge passed down over time, always tied to real use, wear, and the demands of urban life. Without that manual knowledge, Jerusalem would quickly lose its ability to stay active. Without storage, a city surrounded by walls becomes hostage to improvisation. Grain, oil, wine, and other goods must be stored, measured, and protected with method. These storage spaces function like the lungs of the city. What enters them is not just merchandise, it is a margin of safety. And when the regional climate tightens, these rooms become almost as valuable as the walls themselves.
Each afternoon, the residents gathered here in the courtyard to receive their portion of the freshly baked flatbread.
Storing well means holding out longer, reducing losses, and maintaining some degree of stability when the flow coming from outside becomes uncertain or harder to control. In this context, a storehouse is not an administrative detail. It is a direct answer to risk.
The elder woman is still watching us from the shade.
Religion moves through the city without needing to stop its routine. People purify themselves, bring offerings, come and go, and reshape their day around practices that carry collective meaning. It is not a world separate from ordinary life. It is part of it. Faith, discipline, calendar, and coexistence move together. In Jerusalem, the sacred does not remain isolated. It moves through the city itself. Religious practices also help organize behavior, social time, and belonging. They strengthen bonds and give meaning to a life marked by labor, limited space, and a constant awareness of vulnerability. It is a force of cohesion, not simply a ceremonial moment.
Each imminent, every strike of the mallet was critical. The gate had to hold if the city was to survive. Under the watchful eyes of the guards.
Not every important scene happens at the gate, in the market, or in sacred spaces. A great deal happens in these in-between places: stairways, courtyards, entrances, passageways between homes. This is where people pause for a moment, observe, share food, and sense the mood of the neighborhood. It looks simple, but it is not. These places stitch collective life together, and this is where the city shows its most ordinary soul. They are spaces of transition, but also of coexistence, quiet watchfulness, and exchange of information. In Jerusalem, even a brief pause between one task and the next carries a real social function. Sometimes what looks like a break is exactly what keeps the fabric of the community intact.
Securing the household's oil reserves was a vital task. Using clay stoppers and tightly bound cords.
Change does not arrive with cinematic fanfare. It shows up in the details. The guard's gaze lingers longer. The line at the gate moves more slowly. The vendor packs up goods earlier. The family checks provisions with greater care. Have you ever felt a whole place seem to sense something before anyone says it out loud? That is exactly the atmosphere now. Jerusalem is still functioning, but no longer in quite the same way.
Water access points were centers of daily life, but also tension. Keep moving. Next jar forward, quickly now.
Routine continues, but the body of the city reacts with more caution. What used to be habit begins to look like preparation. And when that happens, even the most common gestures take on new weight.
With steady hands, he meticulously rations the stored supply.
When tension rises, the city answers with labor. Wood is adjusted, stone is moved, joints are checked, and access points receive closer attention. Defense stops being background and becomes visible action. Every block of stone shifted into place shows that danger is no distant theory. And in the middle of this dry urgency, without exaggeration and without romance, Jerusalem reveals what it truly is: a city trying to stay ready. The wall begins to absorb direct effort, and maintenance work makes one thing clear. Protection depends on continuous action, not simply on structures existing. The city gets the message and responds with what it has: hands, stone, and urgency.
Clear the center now.
As pressure builds, the city starts pulling resources inward. Grain, oil, fuel, and containers begin to be organized with a new sense of urgency. It is not an overstatement to say that every dragged sack and every sealed jar becomes part of the defense. Can you feel how the tone of routine changes without actually stopping? Jerusalem remains domestic, but now the house itself also works as reserve space.
For the people of Jerusalem, bread is life. Despite the hardships, the baker meticulously works late.
Internal organization grows tighter, movement patterns change, and even the way utensils are stored begins to follow a logic of containment, safety, and predictability. Suddenly, the inside of the home becomes a strategic zone too.
In the quiet confines of the storehouse, the steward maintains strict discipline, meticulously restoring order after the harvest rush.
Water stops being only a daily necessity and moves to the center of decision-making. Access has to be controlled, transport becomes faster, and distribution inside the home grows more rigid. In moments like these, a full jar means time, stability, and a margin of survival. And this is where the city reveals a nearly brutal side of ancient life. Everything depends on how much can be stored, protected, and measured.
Deep within the storehouse, the recorder meticulously logs every jar. This ancient accounting method ensures
What once looked like ordinary routine suddenly carries both domestic and political weight. Water begins to be treated as a vital resource in the fullest sense, and that shifts priorities without needing any formal explanation.
in the quiet corners of ancient Jerusalem storage.
Now tension reaches its highest point. The gate tightens, guards hold their positions, workers run with heavy loads, families reorganize the home, and the streets feel too narrow for everything that needs to happen at once. Have you ever felt an entire place operating right at the edge? That is what this is. Jerusalem does not stop. It compresses, accelerates, and tries to hold itself together inside its own walls. Every space moves into maximum use, and the city makes it clear that its strength lies not only in stone, but in the ability of people to answer pressure together. The peak is not only visual, It is structural, human, and unmistakably urban.
For the evening watchman, the fading light brings heightened tension, a nightly ritual of endurance.
After the peak, the city does not enter rest. It enters adaptation. Bread still has to come out, the guard still has to be maintained, and the storehouses still have to be counted. The rhythm changes, but the demand does not. That is one of the strongest truths here. Crisis does not replace the everyday. It moves inside it. Jerusalem keeps functioning because it has no choice. The family keeps cooking, shifts keep being worked, and resources keep being watched.
These narrow, stepped corridors were the arteries of the city. Every encounter required patience and careful navigation.
What changes is the weight of every gesture, now carried out with greater attention and less room for error. The city keeps moving forward, but already transformed by the pressure that passed through it.
Was a communal effort. Every corner of the courtyard was used.
Not all resistance is loud. Very often it appears in the repeated gesture of someone checking a jar, pushing the millstone, keeping watch, or dividing resources in silence. It is a kind of steadiness without heroic posture, without spectacle, just labor, exhaustion, and persistence. And deep down, that is what keeps the city standing. Life goes on in small movements, nearly discreet, but decisive. The effort is no longer in the burst of activity, but in continuity.
Courtyard is the heart of the household. Every moment is dedicated to survival. Grinding flour.
Jerusalem resists when it keeps producing food, caring for the household, and holding its positions even after exhaustion sets in. It is resistance made of routine, not of
Squeeze past, please.
It just barely fits.
Hold tight to your bundle.
Inside these walls, no one truly lives alone. Space is shared, paths cross, sounds enter the houses, and survival depends on constant coordination. Courtyards, stairs, doors, and rooftops all function as parts of the same machine. Does it feel crowded? Because it is. Jerusalem is a city where collective life shapes even the way people walk.
Rough stone and sealed with a simple mixture of mud and straw.
Life in ancient Jerusalem was defined by these simple, daily rituals.
With measured precision, the artisan binds the handle. It is this meticulous work
Everybody adjusts its movement to the movement of others, and that applies to labor, to rest, and to circulation. The city exists because its inhabitants learn how to live within very concrete limits. Urban space demands permanent adaptation, and no one escapes that completely.
In a world where every tool was precious, the role of the rebinder was vital. With practiced hands, he wraps the cords.
The stone bears the marks of generations.
The city also speaks through wear. Floors smoothed by countless footsteps, patched walls, reused tools, jars marked by use. All of it tells a concrete story. We are not looking at a past sealed behind glass. We are looking at matter worn down by hands, bodies, and repetition. And maybe that is exactly where ancient life becomes most real. What survives is not only the shape of the city, but the mark left behind by everyday gestures.
The scale of the ancient city unfolds. The gates, the walls, the cluster.
The massive stone fortifications of the gate complex dictated the rhythm of the city. Movement here
Jerusalem appears then as a lived in space, repaired, maintained, and slowly transformed by those who depended on it every day. The past becomes visible precisely where use left its marks.
The guards maintained a constant vigil. Their presence
A constant flow of workers and residents moving in and out from dawn until dusk.
After following pressure, labor, and adaptation, the urban structure takes on a different meaning. The gate, the wall, the stairway, the courtyard, and the flat roof stop being mere scenery. Each part answers a need: defense, movement, storage, observation, coexistence. Can you see how everything fits together more clearly now? Jerusalem, from the inside, works like a system. Nothing is isolated. House and wall speak to each other. Street and courtyard complete one another.
As the careful brushing reveals the floor lines, we can start to piece together the domestic life that once thrived.
The upper and lower parts of the city organize different kinds of movement. Only by seeing the city from within does its logic begin to make complete sense. And then the landscape stops being merely beautiful or ancient. It becomes understandable.
We begin to see how households in ancient Jerusalem stored their goods. As the dirt is cleared, the silent evidence of daily life emerges. This worn stone threshold tells a story of repeated passage. Millennia of history are etched into this stone. The wall, once thought lost, now reveals the truth.
The upper and lower parts of the city organize different kinds of movement. Only by seeing the city from within does its logic begin to make complete sense. And then the landscape stops being merely beautiful or ancient. It becomes understandable.
As the hand traces the worn stone edge, we feel the presence of the past. This narrow passage served as beneath the layers of time. Archaeologists meticulously reveal a surviving trace of urban life, a narrow lane from ancient Jerusalem.
This video was a historical AI reconstruction based on records from the period, created for educational and narrative purposes.
Each fragment helps restore human scale to Jerusalem, showing how the urban past was built by common, repeated actions. When read carefully, the trace gives body back to history. In the end, living inside the walls of ancient Jerusalem meant far more than simply inhabiting a city surrounded by stone. It meant sharing space, measuring resources, obeying the rhythm of labor, living under watch, and maintaining routine even when tension closed in. What remains today confirms that in detail. Yes, the city was made of walls, but it was sustained by ordinary people. And that very human reality is what still travels through time. Jerusalem remains important, not only for what it represented, but for what it still reveals about adaptation, collective effort, and ancient urban life. It is that everyday existence, not only the monument, that keeps the city alive in historical memory.